When you look at the Bible, what do you see? Well, you see a pretty fat book, don't you? But, as with any book that we think about reading, for instance, when you're in the store, looking at a book to decide what you're going to read, how do you decide if you're going to read it or not? Well, sometimes the title on the front might catch our attention. But don't we always either go to the back cover or the inside flyleaf and read about what the book is about before we decide whether or not we're interested in that book? We know the Bible is similar. You can always learn from commentaries or learn from study Bibles as you look at them what the Bible is about. But the Bible gives its best definition of what it's about. And it's similar to what you do with a book in the bookstore. You go to the front of the Bible and you see the first 3 chapters. And then you go to the back of the Bible and you see the last 3 chapters. And you know what you learn? You learn why God wrote the Bible. Because what do you see? In Genesis chapter 1, 2, and 3, you have the very beginnings of the universe. Chapter 1 describes how God created the universe in 6 days. In the final part of the creation, he creates mankind. But almost every day of creation, at the end of that day of creation, God says, and it was good. On the last day of creation, after he creates mankind, God says, it was very good. Now, what does that mean? Good. Very good. We know one of the ways we can know what good means in that context is to see what is not good. In chapter 2, we have an extended view of the 6th day, the creation of mankind. And on that extended version of the 6th day, the extended view, to see a little deeper about how things happen and when things happened, we see God created man, Adam, first. He created him from the dust of the ground, and he breathed into him, and man became a living soul. Well, from that time, during that time, for a short time, Adam was alone. He was the only human being on the world. And within chapter 2, that's when we see God say, it is not good. Well, what was wrong? Well, we know what was wrong. Man was alone. Man did not have his helpmeet. Eve had not been created. After God created Eve, Eve was the last part of humanity that was created, the woman. After man and woman were created is when God said it was very good. Well, what went from being not good to being very good? Well, the not good was something's not complete. Something is not the way it's supposed to be. Something is missing. And once Eve was created, then it was good. It was very good. All of creation was done. Everything was completed. Well, what do we see in the beginning before man sinned? Well, before man sinned, especially when you take into what it says in chapter 3, we find out that man is living in a paradise with God. The tree of life is there. And so when we find out in chapter 3, if man were to reach and take and eat from that tree of life, he would live forever. There was another tree that was in the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But man was told not to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But do you recognize something? Sometimes we miss it. Man was told not to eat of that tree. But in chapter 2, he says, every other tree of the garden you may eat of. In other words, including the tree of life. So here we have man living in a paradise with God forever because of the tree of life. God's plan was for man to live with God forever in a paradise. There is no death. There is no pain. There is no sin. That is what God had planned in the beginning. And of course, we know what happens within chapter 3, man sins. And within his sin, then he doesn't have access to the tree of life. So now what do we have? Man kicked out of the garden. no longer living in that paradise, separated from God, in sin, going to die, spiritually already having died, and there is pain, chapter 3. There is a curse, chapter 3. That was the beginning. So it goes from being very good to there being a major problem. Now, what do we see at the end of the Bible? Revelation chapter 20, 21, and 22. Well, at the end of chapter 20, we see Judgment Day, where all of mankind is standing before the throne, and man is being judged according to what he had done during his life. The books were opened, including the book of life. And anyone whose name was not written in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. But those who were not thrown in the lake of fire, Revelation 21, describes as the bride of Christ coming down out of heaven. Where was he coming to? Well, there we see he's coming down to the new earth. See, in Revelation chapter 20, God describes there how the old earth, the old heaven, and the old earth had passed away. He says the same thing in the beginning of chapter 21. And there was a new heaven and a new earth. Now, this new heaven and new earth is describing where man is going to live. Because here we have the bride of Christ, the saved, those who were not eternally condemned, coming down to the new earth. The place where he is going to live with God, man is going to live with God forever. Because we see in 21 that there is no death, there is no pain, there is no tears, there is no sin. We go into chapter 22 and we see that it's a paradise where man is living with God, would be with God forever. And guess what we see man is returned to in chapter 22. At the very first 5 verses of chapter 22, we see the tree of life, and its leaves were for the healings of the nation. What did God say about the tree of life back in Genesis chapter 4, Genesis chapter 3? He said there that if man had reached out and ate of the tree of life, he would live forever. And now we see all back to the way it started. Man living with God for eternity. So when we look at the Bible, and we look at the beginning, and we look at the end, we can, just like a book in the bookstore, learn what the Bible is about. The Bible is about getting man back to what God had planned in the beginning.